Right now, you believe your thoughts are yours. That inner voice analyzing these words, forming opinions, making decisions. You're convinced it's authentically you. But what if I told you that voice has been carefully programmed since birth? Consider this. You wake up craving coffee, scrolling social media, feeling anxious about news you can't control. These aren't random thoughts. They're responses to decades of conditioning. The Gnostics understood something we've forgotten. Ignorance isn't passive blindness, it's an active force that hijacks consciousness itself. They called these forces ARCHONS, not literal demons, but patterns of deception that create what I call thought webs. These operate through mimicry, generating emotions and desires that feel completely authentic, while serving agendas you never consciously chose. Your smartphone buzzes, triggering dopamine. Your mind races with manufactured urgency. You feel free while following invisible scripts written by algorithms, advertisers, and social engineers. Thoth taught that the mind is where spiritual battles are won or lost. The ARCHONS convince us the cage is the sky, the chain is our reflection. Understanding this deception is your first step toward genuine mental sovereignty. Picture this. It's 367 CE in the Egyptian desert, and a monk named Pachomius is frantically burying a sealed jar near the cliffs of Nag Hammadi. Inside are 13 leather-bound codices containing some of the most dangerous ideas ever committed to papyrus. Why dangerous? Because these texts claim that everything you've been taught about reality, divinity, and your own nature is a carefully constructed lie. This wasn't just one man's rebellion. Across the ancient Mediterranean world, small groups of seekers were gathering in hidden caves, remote monasteries, and secret chambers beneath bustling cities. They called themselves the Gnostikoi, literally those who know. But here's what made them truly revolutionary. They believed this knowledge wasn't learned from books or teachers. It was remembered, awakened, recovered from the depths of their own divine consciousness. These weren't your typical religious followers sitting passively in pews. The Gnostics were spiritual rebels who had seen through what they called the Great Deception. While mainstream Christianity taught people to have faith in external authorities, the Gnostics taught something far more subversive: direct revelation. They claimed every human being carried a divine spark, a fragment of the true God that could be awakened without priests, bishops, or emperors as intermediaries. Their cosmology reads like the ultimate conspiracy thriller. According to Gnostic texts, our material world isn't the creation of the supreme divine source. Instead, it's the flawed handiwork of an imposter god they called the Demiurge, sometimes named Yaldabaoth, meaning child of chaos. This false creator, drunk on his own power, fashioned the physical universe as a kind of spiritual prison, believing himself to be the only god. But the Demiurge wasn't working alone. Serving him were the ARCHONS, cosmic administrators who maintained this counterfeit reality. Here's the crucial point the Gnostics understood. These weren't ultimate destroyers or demons in the traditional sense. They were imposters, bureaucrats of illusion. Their power came not from genuine divinity, but from humanity's ignorance of their own divine nature. The Gospel of Mary, one of the most profound Gnostic texts, describes how matter gives birth to a passion that has no equal, a kind of spiritual amnesia that makes us forget our true origin. When the Savior speaks in this text, his message isn't about salvation through belief, but awakening through knowledge. Be courageous and do not fear. Think about how radical this was in the ancient world. While Roman emperors claimed divine authority and Christian bishops insisted on their exclusive connection to God, the Gnostics were teaching that every person, slave or free, man or woman, had direct access to the divine. They weren't just questioning religious authority, they were demolishing the entire foundation of hierarchical power. The Gnostic understanding of reality was breathtakingly sophisticated. They saw existence as a vast drama playing out between the higher realms of pure light and consciousness, and this lower realm of matter and illusion. Humanity was caught in between, divine sparks trapped in bodies of clay, dreaming we were separate from our source, while the ARCHONS whispered suggestions that kept us asleep. This is where Thoth enters the picture. Long before the Gnostics, the Egyptian god of wisdom had taught similar principles. Thoth was the keeper of hidden knowledge, the scribe of truth who understood that human consciousness itself was divine. The Hermetic texts attributed to Thoth speak of the same fundamental insight. We are gods who have forgotten our nature, living in a world designed to maintain that forgetfulness. The practical methods these ancient seekers developed were remarkably sophisticated. They created meditation techniques, visualization practices, and philosophical frameworks designed to pierce through archonic influence. They understood that breaking free wasn't about fighting these cosmic imposters directly, it was about remembering who you really are. Now, I need to share something important with you. The deeper we go into these ancient methods, the more sensitive this information becomes. YouTube's algorithms aren't exactly friendly to content that challenges fundamental assumptions about reality and authority. That's why I've created a private newsletter through Insights Academy, where we can explore these teachings without restriction. When you sign up, you'll immediately receive a free copy of the complete Kybalion, the foundational Hermetic text that bridges Thoth's wisdom with practical application. This isn't just another ebook, it's a manual for consciousness transformation that's been carefully preserved for serious seekers. The link is in the description, but understand, this knowledge has always been shared selectively. The Roman Empire and early Christian Church recognized the existential threat these teachings posed. If people could access divine knowledge directly, what need was there for emperors or bishops? The systematic suppression was swift and brutal. Gnostic texts were burned, teachers were executed, and entire communities were scattered. For over 15 centuries, this wisdom survived only in fragments and whispers. Then, in December 1945, an Egyptian farmer named Muhammad al-Samman was digging for fertilizer near those same Nag Hammadi cliffs when his shovel struck that buried jar. Inside were 46 texts that had been hidden since Pachomius buried them 12 centuries earlier. The discovery was nothing short of miraculous. Scholars suddenly had access to complete Gnostic Gospels, revealing a sophisticated spiritual psychology that made modern depth psychology look elementary. These weren't primitive superstitions, they were precise maps of consciousness, detailed analyses of how awareness gets trapped and how it can be liberated. What emerges from these texts is a picture of ancient seekers who had developed incredibly practical methods for recognizing and transcending archonic influence. They understood that the first step wasn't fighting the illusion, but seeing through it. They knew that consciousness itself was the key, not belief, not faith, but direct knowing. The Gnostics had cracked the code that Thoth had been pointing toward all along. Human awareness is not a product of the brain or body, but a divine faculty temporarily focused through physical form. The Archon's power depends entirely on keeping us identified with the temporary rather than the eternal, the conditioned rather than the free. As we'll discover in our next exploration, this ancient understanding provides the foundation for recognizing how these same patterns of influence operate in our modern world, and more importantly, how the methods these spiritual rebels developed can be adapted for contemporary consciousness liberation. In the shadow-filled chambers of ancient Egyptian temples, scribes would carefully inscribe the words of Thoth, the ibis-headed god who held dominion over the most dangerous knowledge of all, the mechanics of consciousness itself. While the Gnostics in their desert caves were mapping the archonic territories of spiritual imprisonment, the followers of Thoth had already spent millennia developing the precise tools needed to navigate these treacherous realms. Thoth wasn't just another deity in the Egyptian pantheon. He was the divine architect of reality's operating system, the cosmic programmer who understood that consciousness and cosmos mirror each other in an intricate dance of creation and limitation. When we examine his role alongside the Gnostic revelations we explored earlier, something remarkable emerges: a complete methodology for recognizing and dismantling the very thought control mechanisms that keep souls trapped in cycles of unconscious reaction. The Hermetic texts, attributed to Thoth in his Greek form as Hermes Trismegistus, contain perhaps the most precise description of how mental imprisonment actually functions. The famous axiom, "as above, so below," isn't mystical poetry, it's a technical specification. The hierarchical control structures we see manifesting in our external world, from corporate pyramids to governmental bureaucracies, are perfect reflections of the hierarchical thought patterns operating within human consciousness. Think about how this works in practice. When your mind automatically categorizes experiences into rigid hierarchies, good versus bad, success versus failure, us versus them, You're literally reproducing the same compartmentalized thinking that creates external systems of control. The ARCHONS, as the Gnostics understood them, don't need to physically manipulate reality when they can simply program consciousness to generate the desired patterns automatically. Thoth's genius lay in recognizing that the mind operates like a cosmic recording device. As the divine scribe, he understood that every thought, every belief, every unconscious assumption gets written into the fabric of experienced reality. But here's where his wisdom becomes practically revolutionary. He also provided the techniques for becoming the conscious editor of this cosmic manuscript. The principle of mentalism, foundational to Hermetic philosophy, states that the all is mind, the universe is mental. This isn't abstract metaphysics. It's describing the actual mechanism through which archonic influence operates. When the Gnostics spoke of the material world as an illusion designed to trap souls, they were pointing to the same phenomenon Thoth had mapped millennia earlier. Reality as we experience it is fundamentally a mental construct, which means it can be consciously restructured by those who understand its true nature. Consider how this applies to the mental programming we discussed in our opening section. Those automatic thought patterns, those seemingly involuntary reactions to external stimuli, they persist because consciousness hasn't yet learned to distinguish between its own authentic awareness and the imposed mental structures it has unconsciously accepted. Thoth's teachings provide the diagnostic tools for making this crucial distinction. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, heavily influenced by Thothic wisdom, describes the soul's journey through various challenges and deceptions in the afterlife. But when we read these texts through a Gnostic lens, they become practical guides for navigating the archonic realms we encounter not just after death, but in every moment of unconscious living. Each demon or guardian the soul must face represents a specific pattern of deceptive thinking that must be recognized and transcended. Thoth's role as psychopomp, guide of souls through the underworld, takes on profound significance here. He doesn't simply escort souls through dangerous territory. He teaches them to develop the inner sight necessary to see through the illusions they encounter. This is identical to the Gnostic concept of gnosis, direct, experiential knowledge that pierces through the veils of archonic deception. The practical applications of Thothic wisdom begin with what the texts call the cultivation of inner silence. This isn't meditation as relaxation technique, but rather training consciousness to observe its own operations without automatically identifying with every thought or emotion that arises. When you can watch your mind's reactions to external stimuli without immediately believing or acting on them, you're developing the same spiritual discernment that Thoth used to navigate between truth and illusion. Ancient Egyptian priests practicing Thothic methods would spend years learning to recognize the difference between thoughts arising from authentic inner wisdom and thoughts implanted through external programming. They understood that the quality of attention itself could be trained to become increasingly refined, eventually capable of detecting even the subtlest forms of consciousness manipulation. This connects directly to Thoth's function as judge of the dead, where he weighs the heart against the feather of Ma'at, truth itself. But this judgment isn't happening only in some future afterlife realm. It's occurring continuously in the present moment, as consciousness learns to distinguish between authentic inner guidance and the various forms of mental static that cloud clear perception. The Emerald Tablet's teaching that transformation must occur simultaneously on multiple levels, as above, so below, provides the key to understanding why individual awakening inevitably triggers collective change. When consciousness learns to recognize and dissolve its own internal patterns of limitation, those same patterns begin dissolving in the external structures that mirror them. Thoth's wisdom offers something the Gnostics sometimes lacked: specific, practical techniques for working with the mind's tendency to create its own prisons. Rather than viewing the material world as inherently evil or false, Thothic teachings recognize it as a training ground where consciousness can learn to master its own creative powers. The revolution in consciousness that both traditions point toward isn't about escaping reality, but about becoming conscious participants in its ongoing creation. When you understand that your thoughts are literally programming your experienced reality, every moment becomes an opportunity to choose freedom over unconscious reaction. Thoth's greatest gift to humanity wasn't just knowledge about consciousness, it was the tools for transforming that knowledge into lived wisdom. The practical keys for unlocking the prison doors that exist primarily in the mind itself. The ancient Gnostics understood something that modern psychology is only beginning to grasp. The battlefield of human consciousness operates on multiple invisible layers, and we're rarely fighting our own battles. When Thoth spoke of the lower nature that binds the soul, he wasn't describing personal weakness. He was mapping the architecture of a sophisticated system of mental imprisonment that the Gnostics called the archonic realm. But here's where we need to shatter a fundamental misconception. Archons aren't demonic entities lurking in shadowy corners or alien overlords pulling strings from distant dimensions. They're something far more subtle and, frankly, more dangerous. Think of them as distortions in the fabric of consciousness itself, echoes that emerged when divine light first entered dense matter and fragmented into countless refractions. Imagine dropping a perfect crystal into murky water. As it sinks, the light passing through it breaks apart, creating false reflections and shadows that dance across the bottom. These shadows aren't separate from the light, they're distortions of it, dependent on it, yet completely lacking its creative essence. This is precisely how archonic forces operate within human awareness. They exist in those unseen layers of thought and emotion that most people never examine directly. You know, that sudden surge of inexplicable anger while stuck in traffic? That crushing wave of despair that hits you while scrolling social media? That gnawing anxiety about your future that keeps you awake at 3 a.m.? The Gnostic texts suggest these aren't always purely personal emotions arising from your individual psyche. Often they're archonic currents, streams of distorted consciousness that have learned to feed on human awareness that has forgotten its divine origin. The Gospel of Mary describes this phenomenon with startling clarity. She speaks of the kingdom of the flesh, where false powers constantly stir desire and confusion until the soul becomes so entangled in reactive patterns that it forgets its own light. These aren't external temptations being imposed from outside, they're internal distortions that masquerade as your own thoughts and feelings. Here's how their influence actually works. Archons operate through imitation. They're master copycats, capable of replicating the surface appearance of authentic spiritual experience while completely lacking the creative spark that gives it life. Think about how many spiritual movements start with genuine insight but gradually become rigid institutions focused more on control than liberation. Or consider how social media platforms have learned to mimic human connection while actually increasing isolation and depression. The mechanics become clearer when you examine specific examples. That compulsive need to check your phone every few minutes? It mimics the soul's genuine desire for connection, but it's been redirected toward a device that provides stimulation without satisfaction. The endless cycle of consumer desire, always needing the next purchase, upgrade, or experience to feel complete. It's a distortion of the soul's authentic longing for wholeness, channeled into patterns that can never actually fulfill that need. The ancient Gnostic texts identified 7 specific powers that create different types of mental prisons. Darkness operates by obscuring clarity, making you forget what you actually know to be true. Desire creates endless wanting that can never be satisfied, because it's directed toward things that can't provide what the soul actually needs. Ignorance isn't lack of information, it's the active forgetting of your divine nature, often disguised as sophisticated knowledge. Then there's death's allure, not physical death, but the psychological attraction to numbness, escapism, and unconsciousness. The pull of flesh represents getting trapped in purely material concerns while losing connection to your spiritual essence. False wisdom appears as intellectual understanding that lacks genuine insight, often creating spiritual pride that actually blocks further growth. Finally, wrathful pride manifests as the ego's desperate attempts to maintain control and superiority, cutting you off from authentic humility and openness. What makes this system so effective is how it operates through collective structures. Media narratives don't just inform, they shape the emotional landscape of entire populations. Political movements don't just organize, they channel spiritual energy into polarized conflicts that drain creative potential. Educational systems don't just teach, they often condition minds to accept external authority while suppressing inner knowing. Thoth's teachings about transcending the lower nature provide crucial insight here. He understood that these distortions aren't overcome through force or resistance, that actually feeds them more energy. Instead, they dissolve through understanding and authentic awareness. When you recognize an archonic influence for what it is, a distortion rather than your true nature, it immediately begins to lose its power over you. This reveals their greatest vulnerability. Archons cannot create anything new. They can only replicate, distort, and drain existing light. They're entirely dependent on unconscious human awareness for their continued existence. Every moment of genuine recognition, every instance of authentic inner knowing, literally withdraws the energy that sustains their influence. This is why these forces seem so threatened by genuine spiritual inquiry and independent thinking. It's not that they're consciously opposing you. They're more like parasitic patterns that cannot survive in the light of direct awareness. When you stop feeding them through unconscious reaction and start examining them with clear seeing, they simply fade away like shadows when you turn on a bright light. The implications are profound. If you're ready to start recognizing these patterns in your own consciousness and learning practical methods for reclaiming your authentic awareness, let me know in the comments. Because once you understand the architecture of mental imprisonment, you can begin to dismantle it systematically. And that's exactly what we'll explore as we dive deeper into Thoth's specific techniques for consciousness liberation. In the heart of every Gnostic text lies a revelation so profound that it fundamentally changes how we understand human nature itself. The Apocryphon of John records a conversation where the Savior reveals something extraordinary to John. "I entered into the midst of their prison, which is the prison of the body. And I said, 'He who hears, let him get up from the deep sleep.' And he wept and shed tears. Bitter tears he wiped from himself, and he said, 'Who is it that calls my name? And from where has this hope come to me, while I am in the chains of the prison?'" What the Savior is describing here isn't metaphorical poetry. It's a precise description of the human condition and the solution hidden within it. Every human being, according to these ancient texts, carries within them an indestructible fragment of the divine source. This isn't some feel-good spiritual platitude. This is describing something as real and tangible as your heartbeat, something the Archons spent enormous effort trying to conceal but could never actually destroy. Think about this for a moment. When the Demiurge and his Archons constructed this material realm as a kind of prison for consciousness, they faced a fundamental problem. They could manipulate, they could deceive, they could create elaborate systems of control, but they could not actually create consciousness itself. That divine spark, that fragment of the true source, had to remain intact within each human being. It was hidden, yes, buried beneath layers of conditioning and material concerns, but it was never corrupted. Thoth understood this principle intimately. In the Hermetic texts attributed to him, he speaks of the divine nature of human consciousness, explaining that we are essentially divine beings having a temporary material experience, not material beings hoping to become spiritual. This isn't just ancient philosophy, it's a recognition of something you can verify in your own direct experience right now. That divine spark is the quiet, alert presence behind your thoughts. It's the awareness that's reading these words, the consciousness that observes your mental activity without getting completely caught up in it. Most people live their entire lives without recognizing this distinction between the thinking mind and the awareness that observes thought. But once you notice it, everything changes. Here's what's remarkable about this inner awareness. It operates completely independently of external circumstances. When your mind is churning with anxiety about the future, there's a part of you that remains perfectly still, simply observing the anxiety without being consumed by it. When you're caught up in anger or frustration, there's an aspect of your consciousness that remains untouched by these emotional storms, watching them play out like weather patterns across the sky of awareness. The Archon's entire system depends on you never making this distinction. Their influence operates through the thinking mind, through emotional reactivity, through identification with external roles and circumstances, but they cannot touch this deeper awareness. They literally cannot access it because it exists on a completely different level of reality. It's not part of their domain. This is why moments of sudden clarity feel so different from ordinary mental activity. You know those experiences when you're facing a complex problem and suddenly, without thinking your way through it, you just know what needs to be done. Or when you're in the middle of emotional turbulence and suddenly there's this profound peace that seems to come from nowhere. These aren't random psychological phenomena. These are moments when your attention drops beneath the level where archonic influence operates and touches that uncorrupted divine spark. The Gnostics called this recognition anamnesis, literally the act of remembering. But this isn't remembering something you learned in the past. This is remembering what you actually are beneath all the layers of conditioning and identification. It's recognizing that your essential nature was never actually touched by any of the manipulation and control systems operating in this realm. In the Gospel of Truth, another Gnostic text, this process is described beautifully. Since oblivion came into existence, because the Father was not known, then, if the Father comes to be known, oblivion will not exist from that moment on. The Father here refers to the true source, and oblivion is this forgetting of our divine nature. The text is saying that simply remembering what we actually are dissolves the entire problem. This is what terrifies the archonic forces more than anything else. It's not that this remembrance removes their influence, it's that it renders them completely irrelevant. When you recognize yourself as this unchanging awareness, as this fragment of divine consciousness, temporarily focused through a material form, the whole game changes. You're no longer playing by their rules because you're operating from a completely different level of reality. The practical implications of this understanding are staggering. Instead of trying to fix yourself or improve your circumstances to find peace, you recognize that peace is already present as your fundamental nature. Instead of seeking validation or security from external sources, you discover an unshakable confidence that comes from knowing what you actually are. Instead of being at the mercy of your thoughts and emotions, you recognize yourself as the space in which they appear and disappear. This isn't about becoming something different. This is about recognizing what was always already true but temporarily forgotten. The divine spark within you isn't something you need to develop or earn. It's something you need to stop overlooking. Pay attention to this in your own experience right now. Notice the awareness that's taking in these words. Notice that this awareness is completely present, completely alert, but not agitated or seeking anything. This is not your personality or your life story or your problems and goals. This is the divine spark the Gnostics were pointing toward, the uncorrupted connection to source that no external force can touch or manipulate. When you begin to live from this recognition, everything in your experience starts to reorganize itself around this deeper truth. This is where the real liberation begins. There's something the Archons desperately hope you'll never discover. It's not hidden in some ancient vault or protected by mystical guardians. It's sitting right there in your consciousness, waiting to be recognized. The Gnostics called it the ultimate weapon against deception, and once you understand how it works, you'll see why these forces of illusion have spent millennia trying to keep you distracted from it. Pure awareness. That's it. Not meditation techniques, not protective rituals, not elaborate ceremonies, just simple, clear awareness itself. Here's what's fascinating about this discovery. The hypostasis of the Archons tells us these forces cannot stand before the vision of the light. But this isn't talking about some mystical beam shooting from your forehead. This light is consciousness itself, your natural ability to observe without getting caught up in what you're observing. Think about what happens when you flip a light switch in a dark room. The darkness doesn't fight back. It doesn't struggle or resist. It simply ceases to exist where light is present. There's no battle, no conflict, just the immediate absence of darkness in the presence of illumination. This is exactly how awareness operates with illusion. The archonic influence that we explored in earlier sections, those patterns of mental imprisonment, those systems designed to keep you disconnected from your divine spark, they all depend on one crucial factor: your unconscious participation. The moment you become truly aware of these patterns, without judgment or emotional reaction, they begin to lose their grip on you. Thoth's teachings emphasize this principle repeatedly. Consciousness shapes reality through observation. When you observe something with clear awareness, you're not just passively watching, you're actively changing the nature of what you're observing. This is why the Gnostic method focuses on seeing through rather than fighting against. Let me give you a practical example. Say you notice fear arising in your consciousness. The archonic pattern wants you to either suppress the fear or become completely identified with it. Both responses feed the system. Suppression creates internal conflict and tension. Complete identification makes you a puppet of the emotion. But there's a third option that the system can't handle: pure awareness. When you simply observe the fear without becoming it, something remarkable happens. You might notice, there's fear present in my awareness right now. Not, I am afraid, but fear is arising. This subtle shift in perspective changes everything. You're no longer the victim of the emotion. You're the conscious space in which the emotion appears. The fear might still be there, but it no longer has the same power over you. It becomes like a cloud passing through the sky of your awareness. The sky isn't threatened by the cloud, isn't trying to push it away or hold on to it. It simply allows the cloud to be present and eventually move on. This is what terrifies archonic influence more than any resistance you could mount. When you resist something, you're still giving it your energy and attention. You're still playing within the system of polarity: good versus evil, light versus dark, freedom versus control. The Archons thrive on this polarity because both sides of any conflict generate the emotional energy they feed on. But awareness transcends polarity entirely. It's not the opposite of ignorance. It's the space in which both knowledge and ignorance can be observed. It's not fighting against deception. It's the clear seeing that makes deception impossible. Jesus pointed to this same principle in the Gospel of Thomas when he spoke about making the two one. He wasn't talking about some mystical merger, but about the unified consciousness that sees beyond all dualistic thinking. When you operate from this unified awareness, you naturally enter what he called the kingdom, not a place you go to, but a state of consciousness you recognize you've never actually left. Here's how this works in daily life. You're in a conversation and someone says something that normally would trigger anger. Instead of either suppressing the anger or exploding with it, you notice anger is arising. You feel it in your body. You observe the thoughts that come with it, but you don't become it. From this space of awareness, you can respond rather than react. Your response comes from clarity rather than emotional compulsion. Or maybe you notice a strong desire for something: money, recognition, a relationship. Instead of being driven by the desire or fighting against it, you observe it with the same neutral awareness. Desire is present. From this perspective, you can see whether acting on the desire serves your highest good or whether it's just another archonic pattern trying to keep you in a state of perpetual wanting. The key insight here is understanding the difference between reactive consciousness and aware consciousness. Reactive consciousness is always bouncing between attraction and aversion, always caught up in the drama of preferences and judgments. This is exactly what feeds the archonic system. Your unconscious reactions provide the energy that keeps the illusion running. Aware consciousness, on the other hand, observes everything with equal clarity. It doesn't mean you become passive or indifferent. You still make choices, still take action, still feel emotions. But your actions come from clarity rather than compulsion, your choices from wisdom rather than conditioning. What makes this approach so powerful is its immediacy. You don't need years of training or initiation into secret teachings. The moment you shift from identification to awareness, the nature of your experience changes. It's like switching from being an actor caught up in a drama to being the director who sees the whole stage. This awareness severs what the Gnostics called the cord of identification, that unconscious thread that connects your sense of self to external circumstances, emotions, and thoughts. When this cord is cut, through conscious recognition, archonic influence loses its primary access point to your consciousness. The battlefield of consciousness transforms into a sanctuary of peace, not through winning some cosmic war, but through recognizing that the war itself was an illusion. When you're no longer fighting against anything, when you're simply present with whatever arises, you discover the unshakable peace that was always there beneath the surface drama. This is why developing this quality of awareness isn't just personal liberation. It's the most radical act you can take in a world built on unconscious reaction and identification. The Archons' greatest fear isn't your anger at the system or your attempts to escape it. Their greatest fear is your awakening to the simple truth that you were never actually trapped in the first place. The ancient Gnostics understood something that modern neuroscience is only beginning to grasp. Consciousness operates through patterns, and most of these patterns run completely below our awareness. What they called the sleep of forgetfulness isn't just a poetic metaphor, it's a precise description of how reactive patterns keep us trapped in cycles that feed the very forces we're trying to escape. Think about your last argument with someone close to you. Can you remember that moment when something they said triggered an immediate emotional response? Maybe your chest tightened, your jaw clenched, or you felt that familiar surge of defensive energy. In that instant, you weren't responding to what was actually happening. You were reacting from a pattern that's been running your entire life. This is exactly what the Gnostic texts mean when they describe the ARCHONS as rulers of automatic responses. They don't need to actively control you when your own unconscious patterns do the work for them. Every time you react instead of respond, you're feeding energy into the very system that keeps consciousness fragmented and asleep. The Gospel of Mary contains a remarkable passage where the Savior tells Mary to be courageous in the presence of different forms of nature. For centuries, scholars interpreted this as facing external challenges, but the deeper meaning points to something far more practical. The different forms of nature are the various emotional and mental states that arise within us: fear, anger, desire, judgment. Courage here doesn't mean fighting these states or trying to transcend them. It means maintaining clarity while they move through you. This is where Gnostic inner alchemy becomes intensely practical. The Corpus Hermeticum, attributed to Thoth, describes a process of transmutation that turns base emotional reactions into what he calls the gold of consciousness. But this isn't about suppressing emotions or pretending they don't exist. It's about changing your relationship to them entirely. Here's how this ancient process actually works in modern terms. The first step is developing what the Gnostics called the witness, the part of awareness that can observe your own reactions without being consumed by them. When you feel that familiar trigger response beginning, there's usually a split second where you can catch it. Your nervous system starts to activate, but consciousness hasn't completely identified with the reaction yet. This is your window. Instead of immediately following the reaction pattern, you pause. Not to stop the emotion, but to create space around it. The Nag Hammadi texts describe this as standing in the gap between impulse and action. In this gap, something extraordinary becomes possible. The second step involves bringing awareness directly to the physical sensations accompanying the emotional state. Fear might show up as tightness in your throat or shallow breathing. Anger often appears as heat in your chest or tension in your shoulders. Instead of focusing on the story your mind creates about why you're feeling this way, you drop attention into the raw sensation itself. This is where the real alchemy happens. When you meet an emotional state with pure awareness, instead of resistance or identification, its fundamental nature begins to transform. The energy that was locked in the reactive pattern becomes available for conscious use. The Gnostics understood that every emotion, no matter how challenging, contains essential life force that can fuel awakening when properly metabolized. Take fear, for instance. The automatic pattern is either to avoid what triggers the fear or to fight against the feeling itself. But when you bring curious awareness to fear, really investigating its texture and movement in your body, something remarkable occurs. The energy that was bound up in the fear response becomes available as heightened alertness and sensitivity. You're not overcoming fear, you're discovering what fear actually is beneath the story. Anger works similarly. The reactive pattern either explodes outward in blame or implodes in self-criticism. But anger, met with awareness, reveals itself as pure energy for change. The Gnostic texts describe this as the fire that burns away illusion. When you can feel anger's energy without being driven by its agenda, you have access to tremendous power for transformation. Desire presents perhaps the subtlest challenge. The pattern is either to be driven by desire or to try suppressing it. But when you observe desire with awareness, you discover something fascinating. The energy of desire and the energy of love are essentially the same. Desire becomes problematic only when consciousness gets lost in the object of desire rather than recognizing the life force itself. The practice with judgment involves questioning the stories that create separation. When you notice yourself categorizing someone or something as wrong, pause and investigate. What story are you telling yourself? What would happen if that story weren't true? This isn't about becoming passive or accepting harmful behavior. It's about responding from clarity rather than from the automatic patterns that keep consciousness fragmented. What the ancient texts make clear is that this isn't just psychological work, it's literally rewiring the nervous system. Every time you choose conscious response over automatic reaction, you're creating new neural pathways. The Gnostics called this building the resurrection body, the subtle energy system that can navigate reality without being trapped by it. The ripple effects extend far beyond your inner experience. As you stop feeding energy into reactive patterns, the people around you begin to shift as well. Relationships that were stuck in repetitive conflicts start to evolve. Situations that used to trigger automatic responses become opportunities for deeper understanding. The ultimate goal, according to the Gnostic understanding, is returning to what they called the original nature, consciousness that's responsive rather than reactive, creative rather than repetitive. This isn't about perfection or never feeling challenging emotions. It's about maintaining your center while the full spectrum of experience moves through you. If you're ready to begin this practice of inner alchemy, start by simply noticing when you're caught in reaction today. Just that recognition begins the transformation. The ARCHONS maintain their influence through unconsciousness. Every moment of awareness is a moment of freedom. And freedom, the Gnostics knew, is contagious. Now that we understand how awareness dissolves illusion and how to break reactive cycles, let's explore the practical technologies that transform this knowledge into lived experience. The ancient Gnostics didn't just theorize about liberation. They developed precise methods for cultivating what they called the pearl of great price, an unshakable center of consciousness that remains free regardless of external circumstances. The foundation of all Gnostic practice is witnessing, the art of observing your thoughts and emotions without becoming them. This isn't meditation in the way most people understand it. You're not trying to empty your mind or achieve some blissful state. You're learning to step back from the constant stream of mental activity and recognize that you are the awareness in which thoughts arise, not the thoughts themselves. Here's how this works in practice. Right now, notice that you're having thoughts about what I'm saying. Maybe you're agreeing, disagreeing, or planning what you'll do later. The revolutionary recognition is this: if you can observe your thoughts, you cannot be your thoughts. There's something deeper than the mental chatter, the observer itself. This observer is what the Gnostics called the divine spark, and it's completely free from archonic manipulation because it exists prior to all mental content. When you identify with thoughts and emotions, you feed energy into the very systems designed to keep you trapped. But when you witness them without attachment, that energy returns to you. It's like unplugging from a machine that's been draining your battery. Suddenly, you have access to your own power again. The Gnostics taught a particularly effective technique for challenging emotions. When fear, anger, or anxiety arises, instead of fighting it or being consumed by it, you simply say internally, "I see you." This isn't suppression. It's acknowledgement without resistance. Fear loses its grip when met with clear seeing rather than reaction. The Gospel of Thomas records Jesus saying, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not have that within you, what you do not have will kill you." That what is within you is this capacity for conscious witnessing. The Gnostics understood that courage isn't about being fearless or defiant. True courage is clarity held steady in the face of whatever arises. When you can remain present with uncomfortable emotions without being swept away by them, you've accessed something the ARCHONS cannot touch, your essential nature. Let me give you specific practices for different parts of your day. When you wake up, before checking your phone or engaging with external demands, take 3 conscious breaths. Set an intention, not for what you want to accomplish, but for how you want to be present. The Hermetic texts emphasize that the quality of consciousness you bring to activities matters more than the activities themselves. During stressful interactions, whether it's a difficult conversation at work or dealing with family dynamics, practice what I call conscious pausing. When you feel yourself getting triggered, take 1 breath and ask internally, what's really happening here? Often you'll discover that the present moment isn't actually threatening. The stress comes from mental stories about what might happen or what someone's behavior means about you. Thoth taught that every moment offers an opportunity for conscious choice. You can either react from conditioning or respond from awareness. The difference isn't always obvious to others, but it's profound for you. Reactive responses drain your energy and reinforce unconscious patterns. Conscious responses, even when they look similar externally, strengthen your inner freedom. Evening practice is particularly powerful for breaking the cycle of unconscious living. Instead of judging your day or rehearsing tomorrow's worries, review what happened with compassionate curiosity. Where did you remain present? Where did you get lost in reaction? The Gnostic text, the Dialogue of the Savior, describes this as becoming acquainted with your own nature. You're not trying to be perfect. You're learning to recognize the difference between consciousness and conditioning. The advanced practices work with more subtle aspects of awareness. Conscious breathing isn't about controlling your breath, but about using it as an anchor for presence. When your mind gets caught in stories, returning, attention to the simple reality of breathing brings you back to the here and now. Nature offers profound opportunities for practice. The Gnostics often retreated to natural settings, not to escape the world, but to remember what's real. When you observe a tree or watch water flowing, you're witnessing existence without the overlay of human mental constructs. This helps calibrate your awareness to what the Hermeticists called the natural order, life expressing itself without resistance or agenda. The cultivation of inner silence is perhaps the most transformative practice. This doesn't mean having no thoughts, but rather discovering the spacious awareness in which thoughts appear. In silence, you begin to recognize your true nature, not as a bundle of thoughts, emotions, and memories, but as the conscious presence that witnesses all experience. What the Gnostics discovered is that consistent practice creates what they called the immortal body, not a physical form, but a stable center of consciousness that remains unchanged by circumstances. This isn't something you achieve through effort, but something you uncover by removing the layers of identification that obscure it. The beautiful paradox is that as you become more established in your essential nature, compassion arises spontaneously. When you're not defending a false sense of self, you naturally extend understanding to others who are still caught in the dream. Your presence becomes a gift that reminds others of their own deeper nature. The Acts of John describes this perfectly. Learn to suffer, and you shall be able not to suffer. When you can remain present with difficulty without resistance, suffering transforms into wisdom. This is the sacred technology that changes everything, not through doing more, but through being more conscious with what's already here. The pearl of great price grows through countless small moments of choosing awareness over automaticity. Each time you witness rather than identify, each time you respond rather than react, you're literally rewiring your consciousness for freedom. When you begin to practice the sacred technologies we've explored, the daily remembrance, the conscious response to archonic manipulation, the inner alchemy of transformation, something remarkable happens that extends far beyond your personal experience. The Gnostics understood a profound truth that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. Consciousness isn't individual. It's a field, and every shift in your awareness creates ripples that touch the entire fabric of human experience. Think about what happens when you drop a stone into still water. The ripples move outward in perfect circles, each wave touching the next until the entire surface is affected. This isn't just a poetic metaphor, it's how consciousness actually works. When you remember your divine nature, when you stop reacting unconsciously to archonic triggers, when you choose gnosis over ignorance, you're not just changing yourself. You're adding light to what the Gnostics called the collective pleroma, the fullness of divine consciousness that we all share. Thoth taught that all minds are connected at their source. What appears as separate individual consciousness is really like waves on an ocean, seemingly distinct but fundamentally one. This means that every moment of awakening, every choice to respond rather than react, every act of remembrance strengthens the entire field of human awareness. You become a transmission point for higher consciousness, whether you realize it or not. The brilliant biologist Rupert Sheldrake discovered something that validates ancient Gnostic wisdom through his research on morphic resonance. He found that when members of a species learn new behaviors or solve new problems, other members of that species, even those with no physical contact, begin demonstrating the same capabilities more easily. It's as if learning creates invisible pathways that make similar learning more accessible to others. This phenomenon explains why spiritual awakening seems to be accelerating exponentially. Each person who breaks free from archonic programming doesn't just liberate themselves, they make liberation easier for everyone who comes after. Your grandmother might have spent decades searching for spiritual truth in isolation. Today, millions of people are asking the same questions, sharing insights, and supporting each other's awakening because the morphic field of consciousness has been prepared by those who came before. We're witnessing what researchers call the 100th monkey effect playing out on a global scale. This concept, derived from studies of Japanese macaques, describes how behavioral changes in a small group suddenly become widespread throughout the entire population once a critical threshold is reached. In spiritual terms, we're approaching that critical mass of awakened individuals that could trigger a species-wide consciousness shift. Look around at what's happening in our world right now. Traditional authority structures that seemed unshakable just decades ago are being questioned everywhere. People are walking away from jobs that don't align with their values. Ancient spiritual practices are being embraced by millions who were raised in purely materialist cultures. Alternative healing modalities are gaining acceptance in mainstream medicine. Independent media is challenging corporate narratives. Decentralized technologies are undermining centralized control systems. This isn't random social change. It's the natural result of increasing numbers of people remembering their true nature and refusing to participate in systems that diminish human consciousness. Each person who stops believing the lie that they're powerless, separate, and dependent makes it harder for those lies to maintain their grip on collective reality. The archonic system is responding exactly as you'd expect a parasitic structure to respond when its host begins developing immunity. We're seeing unprecedented attempts at division, political polarization designed to keep us fighting each other instead of questioning the system itself. We're seeing massive campaigns of distraction, endless entertainment, manufactured crises, and information overload designed to prevent deep thinking. We're witnessing increasingly desperate attempts at control, surveillance technologies, social credit systems, and psychological manipulation techniques that would have been unthinkable just a generation ago. But here's what the Gnostics understood that gives me tremendous hope. These desperate measures actually signal the weakening of archonic influence, not its strengthening. When a system has genuine power, it doesn't need to work so hard to maintain control. The very fact that so much energy is being expended to keep humanity asleep tells us that more and more people are naturally waking up. The ancient Gnostic texts speak of a time when enough souls would remember their divine nature that the archonic system would simply dissolve, like shadows disappearing when light fills a room. We may be witnessing the early stages of this prophesied transformation. So how do you participate consciously in this collective awakening? First, remember that your primary contribution is your own transformation. Every moment you choose awareness over unconsciousness, every time you respond from your divine nature rather than react from programmed patterns, you strengthen the field of awakened consciousness for everyone. Share your insights, but do it through example rather than preaching. People are drawn to authenticity, not arguments. When you embody the peace and clarity that comes from Gnostic practice, others naturally want to understand how you've found that state. Maintain compassion for those who seem deeply asleep. Remember that we've all been subjected to the same programming, and awakening happens according to each soul's timing. Your job isn't to wake people up, it's to be awake yourself and available when others are ready to learn. Work for positive change in whatever ways align with your gifts and circumstances, but stay detached from outcomes. The Gnostics taught that attachment to results is itself a form of archonic trap. Do what feels right from your highest understanding, then trust the larger intelligence of consciousness to orchestrate the perfect unfolding. We're living through one of the most extraordinary periods in human history, a time when the ancient promise of collective awakening is becoming manifest reality. Your individual journey of remembrance is simultaneously the most personal thing you can do and the greatest gift you can offer to our species. The ripples of your awakening are already touching lives you'll never know about, creating pathways of possibility for souls you'll never meet, contributing to a transformation that will echo through generations yet to come. When you finally see through the archonic veil, something extraordinary happens. The world doesn't change, you do. The same traffic, the same bills, the same relationships exist, but you're no longer trapped in their gravitational pull. This is what the Gnostics called returning to the pleroma, not as a distant heaven you'll reach someday, but as the fullness of divine reality that was always here, waiting for your recognition. I remember the first time I truly grasped what Thoth meant when he spoke of the soul's completion. In the Emerald Tablets, he describes beings who have passed from the night into day, and I used to think this was metaphorical. Then I met someone who embodied this state completely. They moved through a family crisis with the same serene presence they brought to a sunset. Not because they were detached or uncaring, but because they had found something unshakable within themselves. This is what authentic spiritual completion looks like. It's not the blissed-out withdrawal that New Age culture often promotes. It's full engagement from a place of inner freedom rather than compulsive reaction. When you're no longer identified with the small self that the ARCHONS convinced you were real, you discover what the Pistis Sophia calls the light that knows itself as light. The characteristics of this awakened state are unmistakable once you know what to look for. First, there's an unshakable peace that doesn't depend on circumstances aligning with your preferences. This isn't numbness or spiritual bypassing, it's the deep knowing that your essential nature remains untouched by the dramas playing out in the material realm. The Gospel of Philip describes this beautifully. Those who say they will die first and then rise are in error. If they do not first receive the resurrection while they live, when they die they will receive nothing. Second, compassion arises spontaneously, not as a moral obligation, but as natural recognition. When you see through the illusion of separation, you realize that everyone struggling in archonic consciousness is essentially you, trapped in a different costume. This doesn't make you a doormat. Authentic compassion often requires firm boundaries. But the anger and judgment that once drove your interactions dissolve into understanding. Third, creative power begins flowing through you in ways that feel almost magical. This is what Thoth meant when he spoke of becoming co-creators with the divine mind. When you're aligned with Source rather than fighting against the current of existence, synchronicities multiply. Solutions appear effortlessly, and you find yourself in the right place at the right time with startling frequency. Perhaps most importantly, you develop what I call translucent presence, the ability to move through the world without being of it. You can engage fully with the material realm while remembering it's a temporary classroom, not your permanent home. This is the state Thoth achieved, allowing him to serve as guide for countless souls while never losing his connection to divine truth. The Apocryphon of James captures this perfectly. Be filled with the Spirit, but be lacking in reason, for reason belongs to the soul. It is of the nature of soul. You learn to navigate by inner knowing rather than the mental calculations that once seemed so important. What surprises most people about this awakened state is how ordinary it feels. There are no halos or constant ecstasy. Instead, there's a profound normality. Life becomes what it was always meant to be before the archonic programming convinced you it should be a struggle. You wake up each morning with curiosity rather than dread, meet challenges with interest rather than resistance, and relate to others from wholeness rather than need. This transformation inevitably turns you into what I call a natural teacher, not through preaching or trying to convince anyone of anything, but through your very way of being. People sense something different about you, a quality of presence that reminds them of their own deeper nature. The Nag Hammadi text called Thunder, Perfect Mind, expresses this: I am the one who cries out, and I listen. I appear, and I walk in the seal of my students. Some worry that spiritual awakening means becoming passive or losing your edge. The opposite is true. When you're no longer wasting energy maintaining false identities or fighting battles that don't matter, tremendous power becomes available for what does matter. You become more decisive, not less. More engaged, not withdrawn. More human, not less. The individual completion of this journey serves something far greater than personal liberation. Each person who sees through the archonic illusion becomes what the Gnostics called a pneumatic, a spiritual anchor point that makes it easier for others to find their way home. Your very existence in this awakened state weakens the collective spell and strengthens the morphic field of human consciousness, evolution. As you continue this journey, remember that spiritual awakening isn't a destination but an ongoing deepening. Maintain what Zen calls beginner's mind, the humility to keep learning, growing, and discovering. Trust the inner wisdom that's been activated through your practice. It will guide you more reliably than any external authority ever could. The most beautiful part of this completion is recognizing it's actually a beginning. You've spent lifetimes learning to be human while forgetting you were divine. Now you get to learn what it means to be divine while fully embracing your humanity. This is the eternal return Thoth spoke of, not going back to where you started, but arriving there for the first time with complete understanding. If this resonates with your deepest knowing and you're ready to acknowledge this understanding, comment, "I understood it" below.